How long have you been with us, Melody? 29 years, is it? David Langston leaned back in his leather chair, his voice eerily casual. That's quite the accomplishment. 29 years and 362 days, to be exact, I replied, my stomach nodding as I noticed the manila folder on his desk. In all my years at Grantwell Manufacturing, I'd never been called into a director's office on a Friday afternoon. Something was wrong. I'm Melody Reynolds, 61 years old, and until 5 minutes ago, I was the senior compliance officer at one of St. Paul's largest manufacturing companies. I've spent nearly 3 decades ensuring that Grantwell operated within legal parameters, documenting irregularities, and standing firm when others wanted easy solutions to complex problems. My pension was set to fully vest on Monday, just 3 days away. The milestone I'd worked my entire adult life for was within reach. David slid the folder across his polished desk. Due to budget constraints, we're letting you go. His eyes never met mine. Effective immediately. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Budget constraints? Grantwell had just announced record profits last quarter. This is your severance package, he continued, tapping the folder with his manicured finger. Sign by tomorrow or get nothing. HR will escort you to clean out your desk. I should have felt anger, shock, perhaps even the urge to plead. Instead, a strange calm washed over me. This wasn't random. This was calculated, precisely timed to fall before my pension vested. Thank you for the opportunity, I said quietly, picking up the folder. I didn't open it. David looked surprised by my composure, perhaps expecting tears or protests. But I'd spent my career examining patterns, and this one was clear as day. I stood, smoothed my skirt, and walked out with my dignity intact. Janet from HR hovered awkwardly as I packed my personal items, the photo of my late husband Thomas, the potted plant my daughter had given me when she left for college 15 years ago, and the plaque I'd received for 25 years of service. I didn't take much. Most of what mattered couldn't fit in a cardboard box. I'm so sorry, Melody, Janet whispered, glancing nervously toward the security guard waiting to escort me out. This isn't right. It is what it is, I replied, but inside I knew better. This wasn't just wrong, it was potentially illegal. For the past 4 years, I'd been meticulously documenting financial irregularities that had accelerated since David joined the company. I'd sent detailed memos up the chain, flagged suspicious patterns, and even presented evidence of backdated reports. All of it had been dismissed, buried, or returned with instructions to focus on more pressing matters. As I walked through the lobby one last time, the security guard awkwardly held the door. Have a good weekend, Mrs. Reynolds, he said, clearly uncomfortable with his role in this charade. I nodded politely. I believe I will. The drive home felt surreal. 29 years of dedication ended with a manila folder and a cardboard box. The April rain tapped against my windshield as I navigated the familiar streets of St. Paul, Minnesota, past the cathedral where Thomas and I had married, beyond the school where our daughter had graduated, toward the modest home I'd maintained on my own since becoming a widow 12 years ago. I thought about the sacrifices I'd made for Grantwell, the missed recitals during those early years when I worked late to earn my promotions, the family vacations cut short when compliance emergencies arose, the countless evenings spent reviewing documentation that nobody else had the patience to examine. I'd given the company my prime years, believing in the security that my pension would eventually provide. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat quietly for a moment, allowing myself to feel the weight of what had happened. David Langston had been with the company just 6 months. He'd arrived with a reputation for streamlining operations, which typically meant cutting costs at any price. I'd known we would eventually clash when I refused to certify compliance on his latest cost-cutting initiative, a measure that skirted several regulatory requirements. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly and ruthlessly he would move to eliminate me. Inside, I made myself tea and sat at my kitchen table, finally opening the severance package. The terms were insulting: 3 months' salary in exchange for waiving all rights to future claims against the company. No pension, no healthcare continuation, No acknowledgement of nearly 3 decades of service. Just a check and a legal trap designed to silence me. The document required my signature by 5 p.m. tomorrow. They were counting on fear and desperation to make me sign quickly, without consulting anyone. This wasn't standard practice. It was a targeted effort to rob me of what I'd earned. I set the papers aside and walked to my home office, where I kept my personal records. Behind a row of family photo albums sat a fireproof lockbox, my insurance policy. For 4 years, I'd been bringing home copies of troubling financial documents, keeping detailed notes of conversations, and saving emails that outlined patterns of misconduct. Not because I planned to use them, but because my professional instincts told me something wasn't right. I opened the box and reviewed its contents: loan applications with falsified data, quarterly reports with manipulated figures, emails instructing staff to backdate quality control certifications. It was all there, over 1,000 pages of evidence showing systematic fraud that had accelerated under David's direction. I'd reported every issue through proper channels, only to be ignored or sidelined. I reached for my phone, scrolling to a contact I hadn't called in years. Gregory Santos had been Grantwell's chief financial officer before leaving to work for the Securities and Exchange Commission. He'd always respected my diligence, even when others found it tedious. It's time, I thought, as my finger hovered over his name. The next morning, I woke with purpose. After speaking with Gregory for nearly 2 hours the previous evening, I had a clear path forward. I dressed carefully in the navy suit I reserved for important meetings, as if preparing for battle. In a way, I was. Gregory had listened intently as I outlined the situation and described the documentation I'd collected. His response was measured but resolute. This isn't just wrongful termination, Melody. Based on what you're describing, Grantwell could be facing serious securities violations. The timing with your pension, that's just the tip of the iceberg. He'd explained the whistleblower protections available through the SEC and arranged for me to meet with his team on Monday morning. Don't sign anything, he'd cautioned, and secure those documents somewhere safe. I spent Saturday morning making copies of everything, organizing the evidence chronologically, and preparing a detailed index. The work kept my mind focused, preventing the anger and hurt from overwhelming me. By noon, I had 3 identical packages ready, one for the SEC, one for my personal records, and one that would serve as leverage if needed. My phone rang several times throughout the day. Janet from HR, David Langston, even the company's general counsel. I let each call go to voicemail, listening to their increasingly urgent messages. Melody, we need that paperwork signed today. David's voice was tense. I can come by and pick it up if that helps. The legal counsel was more direct. Ms. Reynolds, it's imperative we receive your signed agreement before close of business. Failure to comply could jeopardize your severance package entirely. Their desperation confirmed what I already suspected. They knew they were vulnerable and wanted my silence secured before the weekend ended. At 4:30 p.m., my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see David standing on my porch, his expensive suit looking out of place in my modest neighborhood. I didn't answer. Melody, I know you're in there, he called through the door. This is ridiculous. Just sign the papers and we can all move on. I watched silently as he eventually placed an envelope in my mailbox and returned to his luxury sedan. Only then did I retrieve it, another copy of the same agreement, with a handwritten note. Final opportunity. Sign by 9 a.m. Monday. That evening, my daughter called for our weekly chat. Elizabeth was concerned by the strange tone in my voice. Mom, what's going on? You sound different. I considered downplaying the situation but decided against it. Elizabeth deserved the truth. I was terminated yesterday, I said simply. What? But you're just days away from your full pension. They can't do that. They did, I replied. But don't worry, I'm handling it. Do you need me to come home? I can be on a flight from Denver tomorrow. No, sweetheart, stay put. I've got this covered. After we hung up, I sat in my living room as darkness fell. thinking about Monday's meeting with the SEC. For years, I'd tried to address these issues internally, believing in the system and the company's integrity. I'd been loyal, discreet, and professional, even when I suspected serious wrongdoing. But Grantwell had made its choice, and now I would make mine. I would not be signing their agreement. I would not be silenced. And most importantly, I would not let them discard 3 decades of my life without consequence. Monday couldn't come soon enough. Monday morning arrived with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I dressed carefully, placed my documentation in a secure briefcase, and drove downtown to the federal building where Gregory had arranged our meeting. The weight of what I was about to do sat heavily on my shoulders, but there was also a sense of rightness to it all. The SEC offices were understated but imposing, all glass partitions and hushed conversations. Gregory met me in the lobby, his familiar face lined with more years but still carrying the sharp intelligence I remembered. "Melody," he said warmly, shaking my hand. "I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." "It's good to see you, Gregory," I replied. "Thank you for taking this seriously." He led me to a conference room where 2 other investigators waited: Angela Brennan, a senior enforcement attorney, and James Weston, a forensic accountant. Both greeted me with professional courtesy. "Mrs. Reynolds," Angela began, "before we start, I want to confirm that you understand the process we're initiating today. Once you share this information with us, an investigation becomes official. There's no turning back." I nodded. "I understand completely." For the next 3 hours, I walked them through my documentation. The irregular financial reporting I'd first noticed 4 years ago, when shipments didn't match invoices. The quality control certifications that had been backdated after products had already been shipped. The pattern of revenue manipulation that had intensified in recent quarters, particularly after David Langston's arrival. James examined the financial documents with growing concern. "These discrepancies aren't small," he noted. "The company has been systematically overstating revenues by at least 18% for the past 2 years. That's securities fraud." "And you reported these issues internally?" Angela asked. "Multiple times," I confirmed, showing them copies of my memos and emails. Each time I was told the issues were being addressed or that I was misinterpreting the data. When David joined 6 months ago, my concerns started being rerouted to his office where they disappeared entirely. Gregory leaned forward. "And you believe your termination was directly related to these reports?" "Without question. The timing, 3 days before my pension vested, makes it obvious. But more than that, I had recently flagged several major issues with David's latest cost-cutting initiative. He needed me gone before I could escalate further." As our meeting concluded, Angela outlined the next steps. "We'll need your formal statement, then we'll begin our investigation, which typically remains confidential until we determine whether enforcement action is warranted." "How long will that take?" I asked. "It varies," she replied. "But given the documentation you've provided and the clear pattern of misconduct, we may move quickly on this one." I hadn't even returned home when my phone rang. It was Janet from HR, her voice trembling. "Melody, something's happening. The board just called an emergency meeting. David's been locked in his office all morning, and there are rumors about SEC investigators contacting our general counsel." So it had begun, faster than I'd anticipated. The SEC must have made immediate contact with Grantwell's legal team. "I'm not surprised," I said calmly. "Did you—" Janet hesitated. "Melody, did you report something?" "I simply did what I should have done years ago," I replied. "What's happening with my pension paperwork?" "That's why I'm calling. The executive committee is reviewing your termination. They've put everything on hold until further notice." An hour later, my phone rang again. This time, it was William Hargrove, the chairman of the board, a man who had barely acknowledged my existence during our few previous interactions. "Ms. Reynolds," he said, his typically confident voice sounding strained. "We seem to have a situation that requires your input. Would you be willing to come to the office tomorrow morning to discuss matters?" I'm afraid that won't be possible, Mr. Hargrove, I replied. Any discussions should include my attorney and potentially representatives from the Securities and Exchange Commission. I'm sure you understand. The silence on the other end was profound. Finally, he cleared his throat. I see. Perhaps we can arrange something more formal, then. As I hung up, I felt no satisfaction, only a deep weariness at the necessity of it all. I had never wanted to be a whistleblower. I had only wanted to do my job with integrity and retire with the security I'd earned. But Grantwell had forced my hand, and now we would all face the consequences. My phone continued to ring throughout the evening, colleagues seeking information, executives attempting damage control. I answered none of them. The time for private conversations had passed. Now everything would happen in the light. By Wednesday morning, the storm had fully broken. Local business publications ran headlines about an SEC investigation into Grantwell Manufacturing, sending the company's stock into a tailspin. Financial analysts who had praised David's efficiency measures just weeks ago now questioned the integrity of the company's entire reporting structure. I received a formal letter from Grantwell's legal department, withdrawing my termination notice and placing me on administrative leave with full benefits pending an internal review. It was a transparent attempt to mitigate damages coming far too late. At 10 a.m., my attorney Barbara Reynolds, no relation, but the coincidence amused us both, accompanied me to a meeting at Grantwell's headquarters. The same security guard who had escorted me out on Friday now nodded respectfully as we entered. The atmosphere in the building was tense, with employees huddled in whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when we passed. We were shown to the main boardroom, where William Hargrove waited with the company's outside counsel and 3 other board members. David Langston was conspicuously absent. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Reynolds," William began, seeming to have aged years in just a few days. "We've initiated a comprehensive internal investigation into the concerns you've raised." Barbara spoke before I could respond. "Let's be clear about something, Mr. Hargrove. Ms. Reynolds didn't suddenly raise these concerns after her termination. She documented and reported them repeatedly over a period of 4 years, as her job required her to do. The company's decision to ignore those reports, and then to terminate her days before her pension vested, speaks volumes." William shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, well, that's part of what we're investigating. I want to personally assure Ms. Reynolds that her termination has been rescinded. We consider her an employee in good standing with all benefits intact." "Including my pension?" I asked directly. "Of course," he replied quickly. "In fact, we're prepared to offer you a consulting role after your retirement, which you can begin immediately if you wish. We value your expertise and—" "My client isn't making any decisions today," Barbara interrupted, "and any discussion about future arrangements should be preceded by a full accounting of how her previous concerns were suppressed." The meeting continued for another hour, with the board members attempting to distance themselves from both David's actions and the financial irregularities I'd documented. They painted themselves as victims of misinformation, expressing shock and disappointment at the apparent misconduct. I remained mostly silent, letting Barbara handle the legal maneuvering while I observed their body language. These were people I'd worked alongside for years, yet they'd never noticed me. Not really. Now they couldn't look away, their expressions a mix of fear and newfound respect. As we prepared to leave, William made one final appeal. "Melody, we're hoping you might consider speaking with the SEC investigators about the corrective actions we're taking. Your support would be invaluable." I looked at him directly for the first time. "Mr. Hargrove, I've spent 29 years dedicated to this company's compliance. During that time, I filed 47 major reports documenting serious irregularities. I sent 16 memos specifically addressing the issues now under investigation. I requested 9 meetings with executive leadership to discuss these concerns, of which only 2 were granted, and neither resulted in action. At what point in that history did I have your support?" The room fell silent. "I'll cooperate fully with both the internal investigation and the SEC," I continued. "But I'll be speaking only to the facts, as I always have." Whether those facts support or damage Grantwell will depend entirely on what you do next, not what you say in this room. As Barbara and I walked out, she whispered, "That was perfectly stated." It wasn't until we reached the parking lot that I allowed myself a deep breath. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation began to fade, leaving me drained but clear-headed. This wasn't victory, not yet. It was merely the beginning of accountability. "What happens now?" I asked Barbara as we stood beside our cars. "Now?" She smiled slightly. "Now they scramble to save what they can while the investigation continues. But make no mistake, Melody, they're terrified of you." I shook my head. "They're not terrified of me, they're terrified of the truth. There's a difference." Barbara nodded thoughtfully. "There is indeed. And that difference is why you'll win this, regardless of how it plays out." As I drove home, I wondered what Thomas would have thought of all this. My late husband had always encouraged my meticulous nature, even when others found it frustrating. "Your attention to detail isn't a quirk, Melody," he'd say. "It's a superpower." Perhaps he'd been right all along. By Friday, exactly 1 week after my termination, the story had evolved into a full-blown corporate scandal. The SEC had issued formal requests for information from Grantwell, and an internal memo from William Hargrove announced David Langston's immediate suspension pending investigation. The company's stock had dropped nearly 30%, triggering concerns from major investors and partners. I was no longer just Melody Reynolds' overlooked compliance officer. Business journals now referred to me as a whistleblower and the woman who exposed Grantwell. The sudden attention was uncomfortable, but I remained focused on the process, working closely with the SEC investigators who now had offices set up in a separate building near Grantwell's headquarters. The evidence I'd provided had opened many doors, but the investigation was revealing even more troubling patterns. Gregory called to update me on their progress. "Melody, it's worse than we thought," he said, his voice grave. "The financial manipulation goes back at least 5 years, predating Langston. He accelerated it, but he didn't start it." "I suspected as much," I replied. "There were irregularities I couldn't fully document because I couldn't access certain executive-level reports." "Well, we can access them now," Gregory continued. "And they tell a story of systematic fraud designed to inflate the company's value. The board is claiming ignorance, but at least 3 members had to have known. They signed off on key transactions." This news should have vindicated me, but instead, it left me feeling hollow. The company I dedicated my life to had been corrupted at levels even I hadn't fully comprehended. The people I'd trusted with my concerns had been actively participating in the very fraud I was reporting. That afternoon, I received a call from Elizabeth. Her voice was tight with anger. "Mom, have you seen the news? They're trying to discredit you." I hadn't. I'd been avoiding media coverage, focusing instead on the official proceedings. "What are they saying?" I asked calmly. "That Grantwell executive, Langston, gave an interview claiming you had performance issues and were bitter about being passed over for promotion. He's making it sound like you're retaliating because of personal grievances." I wasn't surprised. It was a predictable defense strategy: attack the whistleblower's credibility rather than address the allegations. "It doesn't matter, Elizabeth," I assured her. "The evidence speaks for itself. My performance reviews have been exemplary for 29 years. They can't rewrite that history now." But David was trying to do exactly that. By that evening, several news outlets had picked up his narrative, questioning my motives and suggesting I had manipulated documentation to frame him. It was a desperate move from a desperate man, but it still stung to see my integrity questioned so publicly. Barbara called immediately. "Don't respond to any of it," she advised. "The SEC will issue a statement tomorrow clarifying your whistleblower status and the credibility of your evidence. Let the official channels handle this." I wasn't planning to respond, I told her, but I am going to do something else. The next morning, I drove to my local bank and asked to speak with the manager, Tracy Ferguson. I'd known her for years as she handled most of Grantwell's local banking transactions. "Melody," she greeted me warmly. "I've been following the news. How are you holding up?" I'm fine, Tracy, but I need access to my safe deposit box. Inside the private room, I opened the box and removed a sealed envelope I'd placed there 3 years ago. It contained copies of email exchanges between David's predecessor and 2 board members, discussing ways to manage financial appearances during a critical acquisition period. I had found these accidentally while archiving old emails, and something had told me to secure them separately from my other documentation. I hadn't included these in my initial SEC report because they weren't directly related to the current issues. But now, with David attempting to undermine my credibility, they provided crucial context showing that the problematic practices predated my concerns about him specifically. I called Gregory immediately. I have something you need to see, I told him. It changes the narrative completely. As I drove to meet him, I felt no satisfaction, only certainty that the full truth would now emerge, regardless of who it implicated. The emergency board meeting was called for Monday morning, 10 days after my termination and 7 days after the SEC investigation became public. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be there to know what was happening. The additional documentation I'd provided had accelerated the investigation dramatically, implicating not just David, but multiple board members in a years-long pattern of financial manipulation. Gregory called me from outside the meeting room. "It's chaos in there," he reported. The SEC enforcement team just presented their preliminary findings. 3 board members have resigned on the spot. David is trying to claim he was following established practices, but no one's buying it anymore. By noon, Grantwell issued a press release announcing a leadership restructuring and full cooperation with regulatory authorities. The carefully worded statement confirmed the resignation of 4 board members, including William Hargrove, and the termination of David Langston for cause. The company's stock, already battered, dropped another 12%. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was Janet from HR again. "Melody, the interim CEO wants to meet with you. Tomorrow, if possible." The interim CEO was Patricia Donovan, the former chief operating officer who had always treated me with professional respect, if not warmth. I agreed to the meeting but insisted it take place at my attorney's office. When Patricia arrived the next day, she looked exhausted but determined. "Melody, I won't waste time with pleasantries," she began. "The company is in crisis, and you're at the center of it. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you were the only one who consistently did what was right." She slid a folder across the table, eerily similar to the termination paperwork David had presented just 11 days earlier. "This officially rescinds your termination, reinstates your employment retroactively, and confirms your full pension vesting," she explained. "It also includes an additional compensation package recognizing the difficulties you've experienced." I opened the folder. The compensation package included a sum equal to 5 years of my salary, full healthcare coverage for life, and a formal apology from the board. "We're also establishing a new corporate ethics division," Patricia continued. "We'd like you to help design it, as a consultant, after your retirement. Your experience is invaluable." I closed the folder without commenting on the offer. "And David Langston? The board members involved?" Patricia's expression hardened. "Criminal charges are expected. The company will not be defending them." Justice, it seemed, had finally arrived at Grantwell Manufacturing. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom, watching as David Langston and 2 former board members entered guilty pleas to securities fraud charges. The man who had so casually ended my career now looked diminished in his dark suit, his arrogance replaced by defeat. Our eyes met briefly as he turned to leave, and I saw recognition there, not of me specifically, but of what I represented, the consequences of his actions personified. The Grantwell scandal had become a case study in corporate governance failures and the crucial role of internal compliance. I had declined the consulting position with the reorganized company, choosing instead to work with regulatory agencies to develop better whistleblower protocols. My story had inspired other compliance officers to come forward with their own documentation of corporate wrongdoing, creating a ripple effect across industries. The SEC had awarded me a substantial whistleblower payment, 15% of the penalties assessed against Grantwell. Combined with my pension and the settlement, I had more financial security than I'd ever imagined possible. I'd established a scholarship fund for women pursuing careers in corporate ethics and compliance, naming it after Thomas. Elizabeth had relocated to St. Paul to be closer to me, bringing my 2 grandchildren with her. We spent weekends together at my new lakeside home, building memories I'd missed while working all those long hours. One evening, as we sat watching the sunset over the water, Elizabeth asked a question that caught me off guard. "Mom, do you regret staying at Grantwell all those years, given how it ended?" I considered this carefully. "No," I finally answered. "I regret that it was necessary to expose them, but I don't regret my work there. Integrity isn't just about being honest when it's easy. It's about maintaining your principles even when, especially when, it costs you something." Elizabeth nodded thoughtfully. "You taught me that, not with words, but by example." That, I realized, was perhaps the most meaningful outcome of all. Not the vindication, not the financial security, but the knowledge that my choices had shown my daughter what it meant to stand firm in your values, regardless of the consequences. As for Grantwell Manufacturing, the company had survived, though greatly diminished. The new leadership had implemented stringent compliance protocols and transparent reporting practices. They still sent me their annual reports, perhaps as a reminder, perhaps as an apology. I read them carefully, noting the improved practices with professional satisfaction. Some might see my story as one of revenge, but I've never viewed it that way. I simply did what I had always done, documented the facts, reported the truth, and stood by my findings. The difference is that this time, finally, others were forced to listen.